Okay, Science 30, this is going to be a little experiment. So this is the first of probably many YouTube videos that I'm going to provide you guys as lecture. So last class we looked at oxides of oxygen and how they affected emissions and what they did in the environment. So if we go back to last week, we look at carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and metal oxides. Now the purpose of the focus for this week, we're actually going to be looking at sulfur oxides and nitrous oxides because they actually combine with water in precipitation, and they end up making acid precipitation in the atmosphere. So just to review, we talked about CO2 and we talked about a little bit about climate change last week. We talked about the greenhouse effect. We talked about carbon monoxide. I talked about sulfur oxide and how it makes hydrogen sulfide. When hydrogen sulfide is burned off from gas flares, the hydrogen sulfide gets in the atmosphere and makes sulfur dioxides. That can combine with water to make sulfuric acid, so sulfur flaring. Nitrogen is also a part of hydrocarbons, and we get nitrogen monoxide and nitrogen dioxide that can also be spewed from exhaust. Or fossil fuel-based sources that can also get in the atmosphere, and that can actually create nitric acid when combined with precipitation. So the smog problem and fossil fuel issues are not only an issue for respiratory ailments, but also can contribute to acid precipitation. So your assignment that I just posted on D2L is this. So you're assessing factors involved in acid deposition in Alberta. You have all sorts of resources that I've given you in the content section of D2L. Make sure you look at them. There's detailed instructions. You're going to draw a map of Alberta, and you're going to look at predictions for where acid rain will be a problem and where acid rain is a problem currently and where it could be a problem in the future. Anyway, so this is sort of the focus for today's lecture, is looking at acid deposition. So when we burn fossil fuels and metal ores, they produce sulfur dioxide and many other nitric oxides. And you can see from this diagram here, well, not diagram, this image, the coniferous leaves on the right are normal, and then these are ones that have been, this coniferous tree is the one that has been exposed to acid precipitation. Excuse me. So what happens is sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, they'll dissolve in water, and the NOs and SOs create hydronium ions, and that makes acid precipitation. So we can make sulfuric and nitric acid for that. Now, acid deposition can be wet or it can be dry. So if it's wet, it falls as precipitation. If it's dry, the oxides of sulfur and nitrogen are spewed usually from smokestacks, and they end up on the soil, and then when the rain falls, it makes acids on the ground. Right, so this section of the unit is about chemistry. We're looking at acid-base chemistry through the perspective of acid precipitation and how these things are affecting natural environments. Okay, so there's lots of industrial processes, and you can see this here, right, of modern living that creates sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, and then they fall as acid rain. So I'm going to jump around a little bit from slide to slide today. But what you need to know, so I'm looking at slide 15 right now. I'm going to jump up to here. So this shows spring acid shock. So this is an issue with spring runoff in Alberta, where we have lots of industrial processes going on. The nitrogen and sulfur flares from generally oil and gas extraction that will spew the sulfur oxides and the nitric oxides onto the snow. And when the snow melts in the spring, it combines, it becomes water, and then those sulfur and nitrogen oxides mix in with the water, and then you get an acid shock into a natural ecosystem, which significantly lowers the pH of a water body during spring melt. So pH stands for the power of hydronium. We've typically seen this as power of hydrogen, but really what happens in an aqueous solution, so a solution dissolved in water, where water is the solvent, is an acid will combine with the water and make this molecule called hydronium, so H3O+. And so we've talked about this a little bit in chemistry, right? The hydronium ion itself does this, right? So I have a water molecule, and right, so we have covalent bonds, and then the actual hydronium ion combines with a hydrogen bond with an extra hydrogen. So this isn't a true bond; it's a really close association, and that makes the H3O+. And this hydrogen can jump from water molecule to water molecule. So it doesn't stay static. So it's not a true bond; it's a hydrogen bond, a close association. Okay, so H+ ions are highly reactive, right? And they will never exist in nature alone. So you guys have all seen the pH scale. Right, but on the pH scale, right, the power of hydronium scale, 7 is neutral. So you can see, right, water is kind of right in the middle. Now the water that we generally consume around here is slightly basic. It's about 7.1, 7.2, because we have bedrock that's limestone, and it creates bases when dissolved in water. Anything below 7 is acidic. And you can see all these different things that have different levels of pH. Okay? And then anything above 7 is basic. So it makes hydroxide, OH negative, rather than hydronium, which is H3O+. And you can see the differing levels of basicity and the varying levels of acidity. Now the pH scale is a logarithmic scale, meaning that we increase by factors of 10. Every time we change a number, right? So if I look at a pH of 8 versus a pH of 7, pH of 8 is 10 times more basic than a pH of 7, but then we increase by another factor of 10 here, so a pH of 9 is 100 times more basic than a pH of 7, and a pH of 10 would be 10 times 10 times 10, so 1,000 times more basic than pure water. So there would be 1,000 times more hydroxide there, and then the same thing goes over here. All right, where if I go from a pH of 7 to a pH of 6, urine or milk would be 10 times more acidic than water, and then we'd go 10 times 10. So coffee or beer would be 100 times more acidic than a pH of 7. And then if you go to tomato juice would be 1,000 times more acidic than a pH of 7. All right, so we've turned this into a log, and these change by an exponential factor. Okay, so if we look at the acid deposition of ecosystems, so these are lake trout, and you can see that in North America, so I'm going to give you sort of the lowdown for what you can do with your assignment here, and then I'm going to look at some ways to calculate pH and how we actually define these things. And I'm going to give you some textbook references as well. So when we look at acid deposition in ecosystems, what you can see in this slide is this lake trout here is in an acidified lake. This is a healthy lake trout. So you can see the difference. So prevailing winds are a big problem in North America because of the Earth's rotation. Prevailing winds move from west to east. in North America. So as a result, anything that ends up in clouds ultimately moves east throughout North America. So fossil fuels that are burned in Los Angeles, for example, will eventually make their way east towards the eastern seaboard in places like New York City and Washington, D.C. And likewise, anything that's created as acid precipitation in Alberta will make its way east towards the rest of the prairies in Ontario, Quebec, yada, yada, yada. All right, so most of our acid precipitation in North America is actually on the East Coast, because that's where the population center is. So there's a lot of industrial activity that happens there anyway, and then anything that's produced as industrial pollutants in the west makes its way east as well. Okay, so when you look at acid deposition in Canadian lakes, we have to look at a map of Canada, and if we look at sort of nationwide, Canada is covered in mostly Canadian shield, and it's actually a really old stratovolcano, and most of our bedrock in Canada is granite bedrock, and that doesn't have any buffering capacity, so it doesn't have any way to resist pH if acid pH if acid rain falls. So lakes in Western Canada, we have bedrock of limestone here, for the most part. All right, so close to the Rocky Mountains, we have this calcium carbonate, and the calcium carbonate itself. Right, this is calcium carbonate. When it dissolves in water, it breaks up into Ca2 plus CO3 negative. And now this can accept hydrogen ions. So this can buffer pH. So anything with limestone bedrock isn't as affected by acid deposition because there's a natural way to resist pH change when there's a lot of acid precipitation. All right, so buffering is a chemical reaction that minimizes the change of hydronium ion concentration. So if we have something like carbonate that can bond to the hydrogen, we'll make less hydronium, and that's what happens with in a buffering capacity. Okay, so like it says, right, as you can read here, in water, the calcium will dissociate into Ca2 plus and CO3 negative. So anything that has limestone bedrock is able to buffer, and we have that on the prairies where we have limestone bedrock. So you can see, right, in the Rockies, part of what makes these lakes have the vibrant colors they do in the Rockies is the glacial flour, the fine particulate coming off of coming from glaciers pulverizing rock into really fine sediment, but a lot of it is from the limestone as well. Whereas if you look here in a place like Ontario or Manitoba, basically the rest of the country, they have granite bedrock, and this is mostly what Canada is made up of, is that shield. So if I look at a map of Alberta, okay, Alberta kind of looks like this. The shield doesn't actually show up until you get into the far northeastern corner of Alberta. So this is shield, and then the rest is mostly limestone bedrock because the rest of it is old ocean bottom. Okay, so this would all have buffering capacity. So you can see, Calgary, right? If you're going to look at a map in your assignment, right? Edmonton is here. Calgary is in southern Alberta, and Fort McMurray is up here, and it's right on the tip of the Canadian Shield. All right. So if we look at where the bedrock, so this should be something that you should be taking note of for your mapping assignment. But if we look at where parts of the province have buffering capacity, anywhere that is not shield, so all of this, right? So this is all limestone. There's buffering capacity there, so it will resist pH change in water bodies because of acid precipitation. But here, this is granite. So there's no buffering. So where we have our biggest oil sands mines in northern Alberta is where we actually have the least ability to buffer acid precipitation. I'm just grabbing myself an eraser here. So that's a big deal, right? When we have large amounts of emissions of sulfur and nitrogen in the northeastern part of the province, because we have our biggest oil sands mines there, we have our lowest ability to be able to buffer. So that's something you should take note of for your map. Okay. So eastern lakes generally are prone to acidification because there's little buffering capacity. The bedrock is granite, and there's no limestone to buffer hydronium. Okay. There's also high population and urban density, so there's more atmospheric pollutants that can create acid rain. So this shows an acidified lake in the Adirondacks in New York State. So this would be just south of the southern Ontario border. And you can see that it's pretty much devoid of life. It'd be very clear, but this is from industrial activity. So it's something we definitely need to take care of and be aware of when we have large-scale industrial projects. So page 196 in your textbook shows what happens to nutrient availability when the pH changes in soil. And what you can see overall is as the pH changes from neutral to more acidic, there's less and less nutrients available for the most part because they all leach out. So this is, so when pH changes, what you can see here, this is a normal leaf, and then this is a leaf that has been in acidified soil. This is called chlorosis, where the plants lose their color because nutrients have leached out. So pH changes due to acidification result in changes to nutrient availability. So the hydronium, what happens is the hydrogens bond with some of these metals, and they no longer exist as ions in the soil, so they're no longer bioavailable. All right, so the nitrogen will bond with the hydrogen, for example, and the phosphorus will bond with the hydrogen, the excess hydrogen, and they'll no longer be available as nitrogen or phosphorus. They'll be like ammonia or a phosphate compound bonded with hydrogen, and they can't use that for nutrients anymore. So acid precipitation has a lot of consequences as a result. So this is another piece that you should understand about acid precipitation. And this is something you'll have to look at a few times. So acidity causes the leaching of metals. So particularly if there's high levels of aluminum and mercury. So the leaching, what it does is it extracts a substance from a solid by dissolving it into a liquid. And removal of these ions from topsoil allows them to move into lower levels or into surface water. And then so like mercury in the surface water itself will toxify groundwater. Aluminum and mercury are both known neurotoxins, so we don't really want that happening, obviously. Okay, so so aluminum itself is usually bound to the soil as aluminum hydroxide, which is not very soluble. And the acids dissociate aluminum from the hydroxide in the soil. So you'll separate, so the hydrogen will separate the aluminum from the soil. So what happens is the aluminum ion increases over time with exposure to acid. And the aluminum is really toxic. So what does it do? It decreases root growth. It prevents calcium absorption, right? And we need calcium for muscle contraction and healthy bone growth. It reduces the amount of soil bacteria, so decomposition stops happening. And again, it's also a neurotoxin. So here's the reaction, and you should take note of this. So aluminum normally exists as, all right, so it's Al3+, that's the charge on it, right? So if I look at my periodic table, aluminum is right here. Okay, aluminum has a charge of 3 plus, right? So when we make aluminum, aluminum will make aluminum hydroxide because OH is OH negative, right? If I look at my periodic table, here's OH negative right here. It is a polyatomic ion. Okay, when it bonds, right, so what happens here is when H plus is in the soil, okay, it will bond with the hydroxide and make H2O, and then we'll make Al3 plus. And then the Al3 plus builds up in the soil. Okay. Oops. And then that'll contaminate the soil. So the hydrogen from the acid precipitation, right? So this would be like HNO3 or something like that, right? That would be the nitric acid. If it's falling from acid precipitation because it's dissolved in water, the H plus would be liberated, and then it would bond with the OH negative in the aluminum hydroxide and then make water, and then the aluminum would be rescued from that and free to do whatever it wants, which it'll build up in natural ecosystems. Mercury as well, so you can see how little mercury we need to contaminate a large lake. So this is the same thing. So mercury has no function in the in living organisms, right? So once they're exposed, living organisms convert mercury to methylmercury, and it's absorbed in the fatty tissue. So mercury is usually, again, it's usually actually bonded if it exists naturally in the soil. It's bonded in the soil as mercuric oxide, HgOH2. Because mercury is a charge of 2 plus, so H is a charge of 2 negative, right? So at the H plus, what happens is this Hg2 plus gets liberated, and the hydrogen bonds with the OH and makes H2O. Okay, and then this is free to be absorbed. Right. Okay. So the mercury itself, once it's liberated, it's free to be absorbed by organisms, and then that again, no neurotoxin, and causes a ton of damage. So we want to try to avoid acid precipitation at all costs, right? For lots of different reasons. So you can see this. So this is something that you need to understand is bioaccumulation. You have seen a lot of this already in Bio 20, but what happens with, right, so bioaccumulation is the tendency of a pollutant to appear at higher concentration at higher levels in the food chain. So again, you can look at my notes for this, but you've seen this called biomagnification as well. But if you go back, right, so mercury and aluminum can't be broken down by animals or natural substances, so they just get passed along the food chain. And if you remember, right, if we remember from junior high science or from Bio 20, you guys talked about this in Science 14 and 24 as well, this is an ecological pyramid. Okay, so this is an ecological pyramid, and what we have here on the bottom are producers, and then primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers, and in some cases you have quaternary consumers as well, which would be apex predators, but there's less organisms at the bottom compared to the top. So let's say, for example, I have 1,000 blades of grass. We have this rule with ecological pyramids called the rule of 10. Right? And only 10% of energy is passed on to the next level. So we lose 90% of all of this energy that's produced by the producers when we go to the next stage. So when we look at a consumption pattern here, this would be like a grasshopper that would eat grass. Okay, so energy always goes up the food chain and never goes down. Okay, so because we lose 90% of this energy, there's only going to be 10% of the biomass here, or 10% of the weight taking up living organisms. So if I have 1,000 blades of grass, there's only going to be 100 grasshoppers. And then let's say we have a garter snake that eats the grasshopper. Right? We'd lose another 90% of that energy. And so there'd only be, so we'd have 10% of this. So there's only 10 garter snakes. And then as we go to the next level, let's say these are hawks. Right? There would only be one hawk. All right? So the deal is, in order to have a very large predator, you have to have a large base in order to sustain that. Because we lose 90% of the energy when one thing consumes another because of heat and inefficiencies in the digestion process. So what happens with biomagnification is, let's say there's 0.2 micrograms of mercury here. Okay? There would be 0.2 micrograms of mercury spread out amongst 1,000 blades of grass. But remember that the mercury or the aluminum cannot be broken down. So all of it gets transferred to the next level. So there's still 0.2 micrograms of mercury here, and there's still 0.2 micrograms of mercury here, and then there's still 0.2 micrograms of mercury here, concentrated in these tissues. Now, this might not be a big deal if you're a blade of grass, because this is spread out amongst 1,000 organisms. It gets to be a bit of a bigger deal when we move up the trophic levels, though. So now there's 0.2 micrograms spread out amongst 100 individuals, and then 0.2 micrograms of mercury spread out amongst 10 individuals at the next level. So what happens is these aluminum and mercury, because they're not broken down, their concentration remains the same, but the amount of biomass decreases as we go up trophic levels. So there's less and less organisms to spread these toxins around as we move up the food web. And this is why biomagnification and bioaccumulation is such a harmful thing for apex predators. They often end up with toxic tissues as a result. This is a really, really high concentration of mercury for any organism, and that would be fatal for a hawk, right? So that is that's the big deal that we're talking about here with biomagnification. Is these chemicals, they don't break down, so they concentrate up the food chain because there's less and less mass at each level of the food chain. Now I gotta sign in here again. All right, so that's bioaccumulation. So what we're talking about, this is just a general thing for us to know. What we're talking about in an environment, this is a bit of a review, are things that are biotic and things that are abiotic. So things that in an environment that affect growth, that are biotic, are living things in an environment that affect other things. You should understand what biodiversity means in this part of the unit. So it's the variety and the breadth of life. So not only the amount, but the types of different types of life in an ecosystem. So the diversity and the actual number. So acid precipitation affects all these things, right? Competition, predation, disease, parasitism, food availability. Those are all things that are biotic factors that affect growth. Something like nitric oxide or sulfuric oxide falling from fossil fuel burning when it dissolves with water would be an abiotic limiting factor. But you can see that it affects soil quality. It affects the types of metals that are present in the soil. It affects the availability of the absorption of different types of pollutants in the soil. So those would be abiotic factors. So those are non-living things that affect growth in an environment. All right, so when we look at nutrient availability, again, those are all abiotic factors that limit growth. Okay. So next part of this, I'm going to talk about titration in a second here. But you have to know a few things with acid base. So I'm basically just giving you an acid base lecture today. We need to know the difference between weak acids and strong acids. So when we look at strong acids are things that, so this is an example of a strong acid. So something like nitric acid or sulfuric acid, when it dissolves in water, it completely dissociates and makes ions. Weak acids would be something like vinegar. So a pH of 3, like a vinegar with a pH of 3, would have way less hydronium ion than nitric acid with a pH of 3, right? So you can see that with this weak acid here, does not make as many ions, so it doesn't dissociate as completely. So this shows you some differences between strong acids and weak acids on page 214 of your textbook. Okay, right, so you can see ethanoic acid here. This is a weak acid. It's going to make hydronium and acetate. Hydrochloric acid makes hydronium and chloride ion. The difference is the hydrochloric acid will completely, all of the HCl will end up as H3O+, whereas the CH3COOH, not all of it will end up as H3O+. A lot of it will just stay as CH3COOH. All right? So it won't completely dissociate. So acid-base stuff. So this is, all right, so we talked about buffering capacity. Right, so buffers are substances in soil or water in the environment that can neutralize the acids from wet or dry acid deposition, and as a result, they prevent pH change when faced with acid deposition. Okay, so that's a big thing that we need to understand. Those are the main things that you need to know for your assignment. Okay, I'm just going to give you some examples of acid-base equations. But before we do that, let's look at just some differences between matter. So when we talk about acids, we're talking about mostly ionic compounds. Sometimes they're organic, so they have a molecular component, but they act as polyatomic ions. So ionic compound, right, makes ions, and we get this crystal lattice structure of cations and anions. Now molecular compounds, they're a chain of nonmetals. They share valence electrons. They don't transfer electrons. Then they don't separate, just like an ionic compound would. Okay. So when we look at acids, all right, ionic compounds are going to make electrolytes. So they're going to dissolve into ions, and